All right, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us for the April Public Forum demo debate on the International Monetary Fund topic. Debating for the affirmative, speaking first, Arnab Sarkar, speaking second, Conrad Pallor, and then on the negative side, speaking first, Roy Tiefer, and then speaking second, Siva Simbasabam. So we'll get started.
Cool. Contention one is cryptocurrency. The IMF will define the future of cryptocurrency as Hui-20 writes that countries across every continent working with the IMF formalize the use of central digital banking currencies in banking systems. The IMF will have technical capabilities to facilitate transactions involving these countries by the end of 2025. And centralization of cryptocurrency is key, as Goldsmith 20 writes that centralization of the underlying blockchain networks would almost certainly allow the government to eliminate any pseudo-anonymity and mitigate criminal activity, providing stability and address such volatility concerns. The first impact is terrorism. Popper 19 writes that in recent months, organizations that track terrorist financing have begun raising alarms about an uptick in organizations experimenting with Bitcoin and other digital coins. Authorities note that terrorist attacks are often require little funding, and any spike in terror would be deadly, as the UN 20 writes that a surge in terrorist attacks would have alarming humanitarian consequences, with millions of people affected by food insecurity. The second impact is poverty. Vigna 15 finds that 5 billion people are cut off from the global economy. One of the biggest prospects is using cryptocurrency to bring these billions of people into the 21st century. That reduces poverty, as Angela 18 finds that crypto could help the unbanked by creating financial alternatives in an efficient and transparent and scalable manner to kickstart accounts. Contention two is economic growth. This happens in three ways. First is through loans. Hessler 18 finds that the IMF programs were successful. IMF short and long-term impacts were largely positive on countries' current accounts, balance of payments, and inflation figures. Among those IMF success stories were loan programs from Mexico as well as India and Kenya. And second is private investment. The IMF 21 writes that in most IMF-supported programs, the IMF is not the only source of financing. IMF financing catalyzes external financing from the private and official sector. The presence of the IMF-supported programs reassures other creditors and encourages them to continue to lend. This enables the country's economy to return to medium-term external viability. And third is foreign aid. Burton Rowland 16 finds that funds assistance may work best by having the positive catalytic effect of foreign aid. A partnership between the IMF and aid donors seems to likely be more efficient as a leading source of economic reform. For these reasons, Mukherjee 08 finds that the mean growth rate among those who received help from the IMF is 2 times higher than the mean growth rate among autocracies. Financial assistance has a strong positive effect on economic growth. Loans from the IMF reduce infant mortality in developing nations. The leaders are politically accountable. Hence, when they receive aids or loans to follow certain policies and foster economic development, they cannot easily divert the obtained financial assistance for extraction or personal use. The first impact is decreasing income inequality. Burt et al. 20 writes that IMF programs independently affect inequality. In the years following the signing of a program, income inequality significantly lower, a decline of almost 18%. The second impact is preventing a COVID depression. Williams and Grutt 20 writes that COVID-19 pandemic could reverse 30 years of progress made by fighting global poverty. Fortunately, Rodin 20 finds that the International Monetary Fund announced it would make $50 billion available to low-income and emerging market economies. A low-cost way to provide aid and decisions literally hold millions of lives in the balance. Contention 3 is fighting climate change. This also happens in 3 ways. The first is through surveillance. The IMF 21 writes that climate change is a fundamental risk to the economic and financial stability. The IMF is committed to helping its members accelerate the transition of the new climate economy by including climate-related financial stability risks in our financial sector surveillance, standardizing disclosure of these risks, enhanced stress tests and assessments of supervisory frameworks help equip central banks with skills that they need to take climate considerations into account. The second is by altering security markets. Hawkins 20 writes that the IMF recognizes that now is a good time to undertake green investment because it has long-term benefits can act in avoiding climate change. And the IMF is committed to research and investment to reprice assets, encouraging green investment. Gopalakrishnan 19 finds that the IMF meetings continue to focus on the climate crisis, examining fiscal policies, looking to the price of climate risks in global stock and bond markets, a promising continuation of the fund's engagement. And the third is through public projects. The IMF 21 writes that green recovery plans will be reflected in the IMF-supported programs. Reforms include public investment projects focused on the boosting of climate-smart technologies. For these reasons, the IMF's climate plan will reduce emissions. As Hawkins 20 writes that the IMF's proposed package could achieve an 80% reduction of emissions by 2050. The first impact is saving lives. Duke 18 quantifies that as many as 153 million premature deaths linked to air pollution could be avoided worldwide if governments reduce fossil fuels. The second impact is economic growth. Green initiatives are key to economic growth, as Vols 20 writes that green projects can generate more employment and deliver higher short-term returns on every dollar spent. For every dollar invested in building climate resilience could result in $10 in economic benefits, and that helps millions, as Reuters 21 concludes that the IMF's investing in green infrastructure could expand global economic output by an average of 0.7% annually over the next 15 years and create millions of jobs. Thus affirm.
Siva and I negate. Overview. The IMF exists for the rich. Global Exchange 11 writes that rich countries dominate decision-making in the IMF because voting power is determined by the amount of money that each country pays into the IMF's quota system. The disproportionate amount of power held by wealthy countries means that the interests of bankers, investors, and corporations from industrialized nations are put above the needs of the world's poor. This structure has remained the same over 8 decades and will never change. As Oakford 14 of Vice writes, an 85% majority of votes is required to make changes to the allotment of power and financing within the IMF. With 16.75% of votes, the U.S. wields complete veto. Through this absolute control, the West uses conditional loans and adjustment programs to strengthen itself while hurting developing nations. With that, contention 1 is moral hazard. McKillen 20 writes that IMF loans enable countries to pursue reckless domestic policies, knowing that if needed, the IMF will bail them out. This safety net delays needed reforms and creates long-term dependency. The IMF also rescues international bankers who've made bad loans, encouraging them to approve even riskier international investments. Meltzer 99 of Carnegie Mellon confirms empirically the existence of subsidized loans from the IMF modifies a finance minister's evaluation of the cost he faces. The large increase in the number of countries experiencing large crises in recent years proves this. Meltzer continues, the past 15 years have seen 90 serious banking crises, most of them followed by deep recessions. In half of these cases, losses exceeded 25% of GDP. These recessions decimate social spending and cost millions of jobs, increasing structural poverty. Thus, Bajori noted the CFR terminalizes a 1% decline in developing country growth, traps an additional 20 million people in poverty. Contention 2 is resource extraction. Downey 10 of NCBI writes, since the breakup of colonial empires, wealthy nations and corporations which consume the bulk of the world's natural resources have relied on debt in the IMF to ensure their continued access to and control over vital raw materials. This occurs with two resource types. Subpoint A is water. In order to monopolize and access water from the global south, Halifax 09 writes, the IMF frequently makes water privatization a requirement of loans and insists on substantial cuts to legal structures to pave the way for water privatization. These requirements then become conditions for any other future loans. The WFA 04 explains that IMF water privatization means consumers must pay the full price of operation and maintenance of water utility rather than sharing with the government, increasing the price of water in developing countries and reducing access to clean water. For example, the WFA writes that in Ghana, IMF policies required a 95% raise in water fees. Thus, Citizen 01 terminalizes the IMF's drive to privatize and extract full cost recovery from water systems robs low-income communities of accessible access to affordable water. The immediate impact is that more than 5 million people, mostly children, die every year from illnesses caused from not drinking water at all or from drinking unsafe water. Subpoint B is mineral extractives. So that Western countries and corporations have a steady supply of cheap minerals, the IMF forces increased raw material exploitation in three ways. First is conditionality. Downey writes the structural adjustment programs imposed on developing nations by the IMF often force them to maintain high levels of raw material exports, as nations are forced to agree that they will pay out large insurance claims if mining activities are disrupted in any way. Second is repayment. Bantower 2000 writes that IMF loans are paving the way for natural resource exploitation on a staggering scale. The focus on export growth for hard currency to pay back loans means unsustainable liquidation of natural resources. Third is currency devaluation. Global Exchange writes that SAPs require countries to value national currencies to make exports cheaper. For example, Yumeen 20 of Colombia writes, IMF required devaluation lowered the cost of Sierra Leone's minerals for other countries, incentivizing diamond extraction and decreasing the amount of revenue the government could generate by selling the gems. This keeps developing nations trapped in poverty as their cheapened exports generate too few funds for them to be able to invest in diversification, which the IMF wouldn't let them do anyways. For these three reasons, resource dependence has only grown. Row 16 of the UN writes, of the 72 countries identified as most dependent on exports, 63 experienced an increase in dependence on extractives over 16 years, which is no fewer than 88%, with countries experiencing increases as large as 94 percentage points. There are two impacts of dependency. First is commodity shocks. Every few years, resource-cursed nations see the price of their primary commodity plummet as new mines or oil fields are discovered or global demand falls. This devastates the economy, leading the OCI to conclude that there is a strong negative correlation between a country's dependence on mineral exports and GDP. These countries also suffer higher rates of poverty, malnutrition, child literacy, authoritarianism, and civil war, known as the resource curse. Second is civil wars. Ross 15 of the IE writes that resource extraction causes grievances among the local population because of land expropriation, environmental hazards, insufficient job opportunities, and social disruptions, which all lead to civil war, which is devastating. As Stain 12 writes that civil wars cause floods of refugees fleeing violence who spread infectious diseases such as HIV and malaria and raise the risk of civil war contagion. Indeed, experts trace the global epidemic of HIV to the Ugandan civil war. Save lives and negate.
Very nice. Okay. Is everyone good for cross? Okay.
Yeah.
You cool if I start? Cool. So I want to talk to you about the civil war's impact. So your Ross evidence indicates a couple of countries that have seen civil wars from resource extraction. Which one of those got loans from the IMF?
The IMF has loaned to almost every single developing country at this point, multiple times. So
which one of those countries does your Ross evidence? Which one of those countries does your Ross evidence indicate caused the civil war?
Well, more important than just looking at which countries our Ross evidence specifically looks at, the OCI evidence is an empirical assessment of all countries that are resource dependent and finds they have higher rates of civil war by a dramatic margin.
That's great. I'm not asking about the OCI evidence. I'm saying your Ross evidence says that countries with resource extraction face civil wars. Of the countries that the IMF has given loan to, what countries are those? That's just my question.
Functionally, all of the ones that are resource dependent, which is over 70. If you'd like me to list 70 countries, I can, but Sierra Leone, Liberia, I think, Angola, definitely.
So those
Nigeria,
are all countries.
twice.
Those are all countries that face a civil war after resource extraction by the IMF.
The IMF doesn't do the resource extraction. The IMF forces them to. And yes, for example, the Biafran War was 3 years after an IMF restructural program, which destroyed Nigeria for 6 decades and killed well over 3 million Biafrans.
That's totally fine. Which one of your cards substantiates that, this war that you talk about?
All of our evidence indicating that resources.
All of your evidence talks about that war that happened.
No.
All of your cards say that.
Arnab, why would we focus on one conflict when the IMF is propagated?
Okay, I'll just get to my point.
I'm going to take a question.
The problem I have, no, real quick. So the problem I have with your evidence, right, is that the conclusion of the article says, quote, there is no evidence in these 13 cases that rebel groups funded their startups by looting natural resources. So in what scenario has the IMF caused a civil war by forcing a country to do resource extraction?
Wait, you're
one of your cards substantiates.
Hold on, Arnab, you're missing the link entirely. They don't fund their fights with these resources. They fight over the resources, or their land was expropriated through things like IMF programs that forced their land.
What card backs up that warrant? No evidence read in the round says that. Your Ross evidence.
Ross says, wait, hold on. This will be the final answer before I take a question, because we've been on this for 2 minutes. But Ross says resource extraction creates grievances among the local population because of land expropriation, environmental hazards, insufficient job opportunities, and social disruptions which lead to civil war.
Fine.
Nowhere in there is that they fund them. Okay, so let's talk about your arguments.
Yeah.
You tell me that the IMF is going to be so fantastic and predict all of these new recessions and COVID crises. Where was the IMF pre-2008? Did they see it coming?
No.
Okay, no, they had absolutely no idea. Where was the IMF pre-1997 Asian banking crisis?
Yeah,
Did they see it coming?
I'm going to take another.
They literally caused it, and they still didn't see it coming. Where were they pre-1980 debt crisis?
Listen, Roy, you can list 5 more recessions and we will still respond with our Mukherjee evidence that analyzes 116 countries, all of which got IMF loans and all of which saw double rates of growth. I'm going to take one last question.
Wait.
Your Meltzer evidence is from 1999 and it analyzes the Russian debt crisis. Has there been any moral hazard after the Russian debt crisis?
That's time. Is everybody ready?
Yeah.
All right, cool. This will be down at the neg. Let's begin. On the overview, Western control of powers is not innately good or bad. Control by developed countries is neither good or bad. They need to win a case argument in order to access the overview. On moral hazard, first, the hypothesis surrounding moral hazard is not backed up in empirical evidence. Ragov 2 explains that almost all IMF loans are paid back in full, meaning that moral hazard theory is empirically denied, as countries do not borrow under the assumption that they can accrue debt and be financially irresponsible, which is why there's no statistically significant interaction between the two. Prefer our evidence over their 2 cards because their borrow 98 card is outdated, does not take into account their unique circumstances, or the Russian debt crisis of 1998, which postdates their evidence, which our evidence analyzes. Also, their borrow evidence says that behavior is the same regardless of receiving IMF assistance. And second, the only other card they read was Macmillan 20, who was a writer for Britannica. Yes, an encyclopedia, whereas ours is a peer-reviewed statistical analysis from researchers at Harvard. Second turn, IMF programs are key to helping countries deal with economic crises. Bird et al. 20 finds that IMF loans are only used in severe cases where a country's economy is already in shambles. IMF loans solve liquidity problems where developing countries do not have the cash necessary to fund basic governmental programs. Bird continues that in the immediate year following an IMF plan, income inequality falls 8% and poverty falls in both the short and long term. Prefer this study over their evidence because it controls for selection bias. That is, the IMF only loans money where countries are in a state of severe economic distress, so the natural trajectory of short-term economic outcomes may appear negative, but when you can control for selection bias, IMF programs empirically increase economic growth. Third, recessions are terminally non-unique to some extent. Roy can point out 100 examples of recession, but recessions are inevitable. No matter whether or not the IMF existed, the COVID-19 pandemic was going to cause a global recession due to the nature of the virus on supply chains and international trade. For that reason, it is far more desirable to have the IMF than not have the IMF as a mitigatory factor in times of recession. Rodin 20 finds that the COVID pandemic, the IMF provided $50 billion to emerging market economies, which help prevent millions and millions of people from starvation or falling into extreme poverty. On contention 2, start with water wars. First turn, water privatization spurs private investment into sanitation infrastructure and empirically decreases infant mortality. Galliani at all 3 finds that privatization of water services empirically decreased child mortality 8% due to improvement in infrastructure, which increased death or decreased death from infection and parasitic diseases. Second turn, their own WFA evidence says that 4 and 8 can solve the water crisis. Our Bird's 15 evidence from our third link at our second contention postdates this by 15 years into the IMF involvement is a prerequisite to 4 and 8. This provides confidence to 8 companies to invest. Third turn, their narrative is a false comparison. Chase 15 finds that water privatization only happens in certain circumstances when local governments fail to adequately distribute water to their citizens, that they request private assistance. For these reasons, Solomon 8 finds that the global access to water increased 58% to 84% due to water privatization. Fourth turn, privatization of water frees up governmental spending for other social programs. Chase continues that privatization, the water sector reduces the burden on public budgets, allowing them to reallocate spending or avoid debt crises. On the impact turn, their evidence is correlative, not causal. The WHO finds that the same figure is due to poor technology and infrastructure. Our contention theory about green tech and infrastructure solves it the same. WHO card they said that we need WPIs and solar ovens to reduce bacteria in water. The IMF is key to the development of those projects, so we solve their argument on causality. On subpoint B about natural resource extraction. First term, natural resource extraction leads to economic growth and diversification. OECD 11 finds that natural resource extraction has been key for economic growth across Africa through exports of agricultural and minerals such as hydrocarbon. Economic growth prereqs their commodity shocks impact as Gelb 10 continues that economic growth through resource extraction frees up capital that allows states to diversify across a series of commodities. In the long term, natural resource extraction becomes a cash cow that allows countries to finance other domestic initiatives and create a robust economy. Malaysia proves empirically Malaysia used capital generated from the natural resource extraction to diversify their economy and invest in energy, communications, transportation. Second, internal link defense. Meta-analysis of 14 econometric studies found no correlation between research extraction and civil conflict. Further over their evidence. First, relationship is reverse causal. Civil wars cause resource depletion as a country's manufacturing sector flees while leaving its resource sector in the economy. Second, alternative causal correlation between civil war and resource dependence not caused by the two, but a third variable. Weak rule of law. Prefer evidence over theirs. Meta-analyses are naturally better, and they holistically examine the literature behind surrounding the argument. Third, turn the argument against them. Positive and ruined and find in 2011 that the main factor in determining whether research extraction leads to positive economic outcomes is the type of governmental institution. This is crucial as the IMF incentivizes better governmental outcomes. Lundgren 13 finds that IMF provides external guidance to ensure transparency, such as technical assistance and taxation of resources and asset management, and incentivizing cross-border cooperation to ensure that the resources are not exploited. This means that we are key to long-term economic prosperity and avoiding civil wars as governments are accountable to the people.
Okay. On water, group all of the turns. They're all about gradual privatization done by states. The IMF enforces rapid privatization, which is why, per our Ghana empiric, increased sanitation and access always happens. On the aid cross application, the WFA says the health and water aid can solve these issues, but Stubbs 19 does a meta-analysis and finds that these increases in aid are provided are budget assistance and debt relief aid. On the extraction turn, they say that it creates rampant growth. Our evidence agrees and finds that most growth due to IMF loans is found in extractive industries that doesn't support high-paying jobs, which drive poverty empirically increases, and the resources are never used for diversification because the IMF wants countries to stay dependent, which is why their loans cut diversification subsidies and why dependency has grown. This is spiked out in our case. They didn't respond to it. Then they say there's no link between civil wars. There's no reason why the manufacturing sector flees. That makes no sense. We say competition over natural resources fuels these wars along with land expropriation, which are definitely better warrants, and our evidence is causal, which means you should definitely prefer it here. Then they say that the IMF ensures accountability and good guidance, but they've conceded 100% that the IMF doesn't care about these countries and is beholden to Western powers because of veto, because the U.S. has veto power, which want the global South, want resources of global South, which is why they guide them in opposite of positive direction. On the first turn about solving crisis, you turn it because Stubbs 19 reports the IMF loans often impose deep austerity measures and budget cuts in times of crisis, increasing poverty, which we'll talk about on their case. On their case on cryptocurrency, on the link, 4 responses. First, their evidence says the World Bank is also capable of centralization. It's not unique. Second, Goldsmith 20 finds that the IMF can only regulate cryptocurrencies in countries that are signatories. However, cryptocurrencies are cross-national, which means there's a huge solvency deficit. But third, they're talking about new government-backed cryptocurrencies, not about regulating existing cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. Implications. First, they have no link because they haven't proven that these currencies will be adopted. Second, they have no internal link because current cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are clearly enough to fuel terrorism per their impact evidence. But third, they have no solvency because any peer-to-peer network is always susceptible to volatility. On the terrorism impact, first, poverty short circuits because poor economic situations push people to illicit activity. But second, even without cryptocurrency, money laundering is always unstoppable. Kajin reports that global anti-money laundering campaigns have only seized 0.1% of funds from crime. On poverty, this just says cryptocurrency is good. No reason it's unique to government-backed cryptocurrency. On C2, group their first 2 links. First, Jensen 04 finds that countries that sign IMF agreements attract 25% less FDI inflows because of the poor reputation from the IMF about destroying country social spending. But second, turn it. Vienna finds that the IMF gives out all loans in forms of structural adjustment programs, which are bad because ENDD finds that 60% of SAP loans require that countries reduce government spending on social services such as healthcare and education as a way to reduce taxes that foreign investors must pay to free up government funds to pay back loans. 3 reasons this is bad. First is healthcare. Izoni finds that during time, oftentimes the IMF forces countries to spend 3 times more on debt servicing than on healthcare, and reductions in healthcare negatively impact the poor, as the World Health Organization finds that 100 million people per year slide into poverty due to higher medical costs. Second, Reimers of Harvard University finds that due to these cuts, enrollment by the poor in schools decreases on average by 70%. Bono finds this lack of access to education traps individuals and countries in vicious cycles of dependence on unskilled jobs, trapping individuals in poverty and countries in poor economic situations in the long term. This outweighs A on scope because education affects every single person in every single country in every sector of the economy, but B, with strong education is the cleanest link to long-term poverty alleviation because it helps countries industrialize, engage in higher skilled labor, and trade within like a increasingly digitized economy. Okay. They say that our evidence is bad because it doesn't collect control for non-random selection. Yeah, it does. All of our studies do. On a turn, if the IMF loans massively increase corruption, Stubbs 19 finds that IMF loans force rapid privatization, which causes the sell-off of government land and industries, as I said on their case. This A, short circuits aid as corrupt officials will siphon it off, and B, independently kills 3.6 million people per year by crushing social spending and government accountability. Then 2 more turns. First, Malk 18 finds that foreign aid is normally given out in the form of predatory loans, which cripple developing countries in the long run and put them in the exact position where they need IMF loans. Prefer this on time frame because it creates cyclical situations for these countries. But second, Kelly 18 finds that aid is easily exploited by terrorist organizations, finding that Al-Shabaab is making millions each year on exploiting foreign aid, which links into their terrorism impact earlier.
On the COVID depression impact, this just magnifies our turn. Oxfam 20 writes 84% of the IMF loans given out during COVID forced cuts of social spending on austerity measures, which left millions of people without healthcare globally and killed hundreds of thousands. On their first two links on C3. None of their arguments have actually materialized. These are just proposals that have existed for years. The IMF doesn't have the capacity to enforce any of these per our overview. On green tech is bad. 2 warrants. First, POTS 11, the RMA finds that when energy efficiency increases, people use more energy, nullifying the effects or making them worse. Sorrells 07 finds in a 500-study meta-analysis that energy efficiency and heating lead to a rebound effect of up to 170%. But second, rapid development of renewables causes e-waste. The AMPT finds that as more green technologies pour into the market, many past technologies will be thrown away. This constant replacement causes tons of e-waste. And McAllister 18 of University of Colorado finds that e-waste is devastating the environment and to human health because technological devices possess large quantities of poisonous chemicals. And finally, the US and China are the largest emitters of climate change. They don't do anything to solve them.
Can you send a doc?
Yeah.
Okay, that was a minute 10 used.
All right. So I'll start with your the water privatization stuff. So you make this analysis when you're frontlining that says that gradualism is your evidence distinguishes between gradual change and immediate change. What evidence makes this distinction?
No, we say that your examples of how privatization has been good for water access in these countries is largely about countries that aren't specific to IMF loans, and we say in countries.
Well, that's not what you said in your speech, but it is specific. We gave a couple of examples.
No, the 58. Wait, Conrad, the 58% evidence that you read just said that water privatization is good, not in the context of IMF loans. That's the analysis that we make. If you want the evidence that indicates that
argument, your argument
let me
is
finish
that privatization is bad.
Well, let me finish real quick. Our evidence. Okay, so first of all, you asked for the evidence. It's the Ghana empiric that indicates that. I don't know what the name of that is, but our Ghana empiric specifically indicates that in the context of IMF loans in Ghana, that is what caused the privatization
the evidence
of water
is water
privatization.
It says what? IMF results in water privatization, but the link is water privatization.
Okay, and you can make that analysis. But we said the warrant that it gives.
We said water privatization is good. No, we agree that
right. Look. Okay,
we both agree with that.
Okay, hold on. I'm gonna finish answering this, and then I'm gonna take a question. Our analysis specifically is the rapid privatization caused by the IMF.
Okay, so what evidence?
The warrants in the evidence. The warrants in the Ghana evidence.
I mean, I know you said that, but I don't know.
What's the card name?
You just say IMF causes privatization. Privatization.
Okay, let me find the card name. And then
we say privatization is good. You don't make any none of your cards ever use the word gradualism. Make that analysis.
Right, but because the warrants that are specific to the IMF are about rapid privatization.
Warrant?
If you want us to read evidence in second,
the only warrant says
gradualism is good.
IMF
we can do that.
Make water privatization a requirement of loans. Where does it say the difference between gradual versus immediate distinction? That distinction that you made.
Okay. Yes.
You literally
say
IMF causes privatization.
Right, Conrad. Okay.
You say
Conrad. Let me finish answering this, and then if you're not happy with my answer, I'm going to take a question. You're going to keep going, right? You are right. We don't have evidence that specifically isolates causality between gradualism and privatization. We don't have that. But what we do have is the warrants that are specific in the Ghana empiric that indicate that the rapid privatization that was caused by the IMF is bad. We can do more analysis later in the round about why gradualism is good, but that's just a warrant right now. It has no empiric. Okay, I'm going to take a question on the impact level of our mineral extraction argument. We say civil war. You read this thing that says it causes a loss in the manufacturing sector, which is why it causes an increase in dependency on natural resources. Yeah. So you say it's reverse causal. Why on earth does a civil war cause an entire?
No, so I think it's a good thing to point you brought up. So your Ross evidence, it's basically the proxy variable they use for resource wealth is resources as a percentage of GDP. And so the argument basically just says is that countries that experience economic crises in general have a huge fleeing out of their manufacturing sector. And so just naturally their resource to GDP level would be increased.
Okay. I get what you're saying, but that's different than the response you read in speech.
No, we also made another alternative causal link is that it's also due to an extraneous variable such as poor governmental institution that causes
that's
not responded to. The cause is not resource dependency causes.
You would have to win that the poor government. Yeah, you would have to win that the poor governments would have a reason to do that absent it, right? And we say that the reason is uniquely caused by the IMF. Yeah, you're right.
Okay, it's going to start on. Yeah, I'll go down our case first. Actually, there's a less to do there, and then I'll go to your case. It'll just be straight up, top down. Okay. Start now. We'll bite the first D link on crypto. Go to our C2. All the turns, you can group them. I'm going to extend turns on their case that weigh and compare against the turns here. Also, all the turns on all the analysis I'm going to do on C3 are also going to weigh against it. Let's go to C3. The first thing they say is that none of our first two links are talking about things in the status quo. Yes, they are. Our Gopala Krishnan evidence says that the IMF is currently negotiating bond prices and stock market prices for climate investment and encouraging more investment into these technologies. That's why our evidence says right now there's investment happening, and our internal link evidence says that the projects that are being developed right now will decrease emissions by 80% by 2050. The other trends that they say is that there's really bad things happening with like green tech. The problem is what RL16 finds, which postdates their meta-analysis and does a new meta-analysis, finds that new renewable technologies that are being developed now are key for farming and industrial development and agriculture. This is the impact that we're going to go for off of our argument because it's about death. We say that when emissions go down, when you're doing less things like farming for like cows and like beef and stuff, that reduces the amount of overall emissions in the air, saves 153 million lives, or at least 80% of that number. Here's the weighing. The reason why this matters is a couple of reasons. A, it acts as a prerequisite into all their 8 terms that they read above. Because if there is more, if emissions go up and weather patterns change faster, then it causes higher amounts of disaster relief need to be given in the form of foreign aid to these other countries, and it's more foreign aid because there's more disaster relief. So ultimately, foreign aid gets a lot worse. But and it magnifies the impact of all the terms they read there as well. The couple other reasons that outweighs. First, on the prayer to the economy as well. 17 finds that climate change would cause the global economy to go down because of agricultural losses, crime, storms, mortality, labor. There's like a bunch of warrants, and it would cause economic growth to go down by 30%. Second, it would cause a pre-reactive trade and hurt the economy that way. The OECD finds that climate change severely decreases international trade, destroys supply, transportation, and distribution chains. Here's the reason why that interacts with their resource extraction argument. Because if there is the reduction in trade, then these economies that already are resource dependent get worse in a world where there's no IMF, because now they don't have any ability to have any support for those economies because they're already dependent on those economies. If you don't have the ability to trade over those resources, then your entire economy collapses. Let's go to their case. Okay, on the C1, the problem is Shiva responds to our first contention turn by just saying that austerity is worse. But the problem is they don't control for the factor, right? Their evidence does not control for selection bias because the IMF always helps countries that are already doing bad. The reason why that's important, right, is because if the IMF is only going into countries that are already being hurt, that means on the comparative analysis, when you don't have the IMF and you do have the IMF, there's automatically going to be worse impacts there. Here's the reason why that matters. First is on time frame weighing. If you look to the short-term implications of the IMF, sure, they can point to a couple of scenarios in which the economy got worse because those economies were already going down. But in the long term, that's when you control for the factors. And our McCurdy evidence says that in 112 countries over 25 years, there was double-digit growth rates in those same countries. That's why you prefer our evidence over theirs on time frame, and you prefer it on a bigger data set and because it controls for factors. Let's go to their C2. They drop a lot here. They just say that all their evidence is about short-term growth. No, it's not. Our evidence also accounts for long-term development of these economies and says that when there was a reduction in infant mortality, when there was privatization of water by 8%, because all these countries now have the ability to get clean water. That's the point. That's why our evidence even says that our Salma evidence says that when countries privatize their water, accessibility went up from 58 to 84%, even with the accountability of price. They don't account for that. Finally, on their last contention about this idea of resource extractions happening, history disproves it. Our turn is so much better than the analysis do. Our OECD evidence says that in Malaysia, for example, it never happened. Prefer the Malaysia empiric over their studies because they don't give you a historic example of it. You don't know when it's happened. Some random study that they did doesn't even prove that it happened in the first place. But you know that resource extraction leads to economic growth in the long term because it gives them cash flow to do in historic countries.
All right, we went a bit over, but we're out.
I'm going to start on our case with the overview from constructive, down our case, down their case. All right. There are a lot of clashing empirics everywhere throughout this round, but what is uncontested is that the IMF serves and will always serve wealthy Western countries and corporations, which frames the round for you and means you default neg because the IMF has incentives to keep countries trapped in crisis and always doing worse, so they always have to go for more SAPs and more loans and can never diversify away from the raw materials that they've conceded Western countries need from them for the Downey evidence, which is why loans are not temporary. The average country goes back every 5 years, disproving all of their arguments about them being beneficial. On our first contention, the default or the discussion between austerity and them solving is very cleanly for us. We do control for non-random selection, which is a conceded frontline from Siva's rebuttal, and we say that austerity measures are what they impose in response to crises and recessions, which is why they always have to take more loans in the future and automatically hurt more. They say that there's a double-digit growth, but they've conceded the growth is usually in extractives and isn't a good indicator because it isn't reducing poverty. And B, they say that they actually are beneficial, but they're entirely wrong. Multiple empirics confirm that these countries could have recovered absent the IMF and did in circumstances without the IMF, but because the IMF came in, our studies control and find that it was actually worse, which is all the conceded turns on their case. On water, our empirics are dramatically more specific than theirs to the IMF. Their empiric is literally from a country that didn't get an IMF loan. It's not just about privatization. They've missed that the IMF specifically enforces something called full cost recovery, where the government pays for nothing anymore, whereas privatization in all other sectors does not do that. The IMF is unique in this because they want to reduce deficits, which is why in specifically IMF circumstances, prices in Ghana went up 95%, turning all of their terms for accessibility in IMF countries went down and millions lost water access. More importantly, you are voting for us an argument about resource extraction. They say reduction in trade controls the link. That's blatantly misunderstanding economics. When you reduce people's trade, they're more able to diversify because they have to subsidize domestic industries rather than exporting to other countries. But either way, this has no link in because empirically dependency is only going up, so their link size is terrible. The only other response is that in Malaysia, it never happened. Check your facts. Malaysia is currently deindustrializing and returning to resource dependency because they got another IMF loan recently, and our evidence finds that the IMF across 67 countries has increased dependency. Don't look to one empiric. The warrant is conceded that the IMF wants to help the West by getting their resources for them, which is why they force countries to pay them back through things like hard currency extraction, and they don't let them disrupt mining things, and they destroy subsidies for things like diversification, which empirically increases the likelihood of civil war. They've conceded that these countries or people fight over resources, and it creates civil wars, which spread pandemics globally because of huge refugee crises affecting every country on earth, not just the ones that the IMF helps, killing millions of people and destroying entire economies. They can invest in green technology. On their case, the FDI turn is conceded. There's 25% less FDI because of after a specific SAP or after any IMF policy because it has such a bad reputation in history, which FDI is typically into green tech. So this prereqs the link into green technology. They can invest in it without foreign direct investment, especially if they're in a pandemic. They've also missed that the austerity measures that I've extended on our case kill millions of people by destroying healthcare spending and have made the COVID recession literally indefinite, which means that they're never going to have enough money to invest. And they don't even frontline that China and the US are the largest emitters in the IMF is not going to fight them per the overview on our case. And they missed that e-waste in green tech like lead is disruptive. And most importantly, resource extraction like oil leads to more emissions and has a larger effect size than green technology. These emissions are only rising in the developing world. Their case is empirically wrong.
I don't have a question. So like,
I'll start with the question. So you keep saying that your studies control for selection bias, like, but you never like said what study controls for selection bias. Like, can I just get?
I am
like which one? No, because like our study is very specific and it was published in 2021, and it was like. We are one of the first studies to ever control for selection bias. And I can read that from my methodology. Like you can say that your studies control for selection bias, but they don't.
Who said like our studies are some of the first to control for selection bias is like when the people in their statistical review for their thesis paper are like, we analyzed the literature and found this was a really unexplored market. And then there's 82 studies that say the same thing.
No.
Our evidence
I'll explain, right? It goes through a literature review. And it said the key methodological issue to deal with is selection bias. Previous studies do not account for that.
Okay.
But I'm just saying, like, what study controls for selection bias? You say our studies do, but like you don't.
That doesn't even matter, right? That's like we have so many layers higher on the debate that like literally being studied about austerity.
Shiva, listen. Shiva, not even.
Okay. You don't reference like one study. Like what? Where
not even.
You can say these things.
Okay, Conrad, that might be the one thing in this round that you're winning, but it doesn't matter. I guarantee you.
Well, that's not the one thing. There are a couple of things. One of them is what I'll explain right now. When looking at both of our studies, even if yours controls, and like if it controls for economic growth and long-term development, why would
I'm fairly sure that like
hold on. Stubbs says the introduction of methods like GBP to control for non-random selection into IMF programs.
Okay, our evidence was selection bias. That's not different than non-random selection.
No. Selection bias is
like, do you understand like the difference?
Like, I don't get why this matters, right? Like
because the reason why it matters is because as the country gives assistance, the IMF only gives assistance to countries that are already on their way down.
I understand.
So it's important. It's important.
That's non-random selection into IMF programs.
Right.
Our evidence controls every point.
This is what I was trying to get at like a minute ago. The reason why it's important, right, is because our evidence does analysis on more countries over a longer time frame and says even on your short-term scale, over 25 years, double-digit growth happens.
Yes. Okay.
And poverty goes up.
Yes. So
no,
I guess
poverty does not go up. Inequality goes down and poverty goes down.
Here's the thing, right? Like, so I think you need to do more work to win that your study is like special in this case. But even if you do, right? One, we read that you don't read any statistics on poverty, which means you're not actually impacting like
we do 18% decrease in poverty in the first year.
Roy, and I said in rebuttal, Roy extends that these are specifically in resource extracting sectors, which means that if we win our resource argument, we completely short circuit this. It doesn't lead to diversification. You also fully concede the front line.
Wait. The warrant you give for why resource extraction prereqs everything is because these countries have like higher debt burdens. Why does that short circuit?
Resource extraction. Rather than defending every warrant across, more importantly, really quickly, one, our studies do control for them. I promise, I cut them myself, or Civic cut them. 2, and more importantly,
That's why we're worried.
they have to take loans every 5 years. The average time out of an IMF loan for a country that has taken one is 5 years, which is dropped out of rebuttal and summary. If
That's
your
great.
evidence was right and they worked, they wouldn't go back every 5 years, but they're stuck in permanent crises because they need
You could
to
argue
be
that if
permanent
they didn't
crises
work, they
to
wouldn't
keep
come back.
exporting.
Like if they work, they probably would come back because it decreased poverty.
It-
And it
it
keeps
lets
Oh,
them-
if they
Wait, why
worked,
wouldn't
they
they be
wouldn't
in a
go back
position
into
to take another
crisis.
loan? Like,
IMF
like
did
Conrad,
your work.
countries aren't like,
Listen,
let's get in
okay,
an economic crisis so
crosses
we can
over,
get another
but
IMF
bottom
loan.
line-
That's not how it works.
Bottom line, it grows over longer term. That's our argument.
But
Okay.
it doesn't.
It's
Accounting
fine,
for
that's fine.
non-random selection, growth goes down and poverty goes up.
That's
And
fine.
even if growth does
Roy,
go up,
Roy, it'll be in
3%.
final focus. It'll be in final focus. Get your pen
Okay,
ready.
okay.
All right. Arnav, you want to call? This round is over when they functionally conceded that the most important argument of the round is climate change and that renewable energy investment causes a decrease in death due to air pollution by 153 million. This outweighs their arguments on magnitude. Also, we control the better link into the economy because green tech investment is key to economic growth, and climate change reversely causes collapse in the global economy. You've not once answered that argument. You might try to go for these green tech arguments, but these were in second summary. The only application you make is that green tech or that foreign investment falls. And this was read at a turn. However, it's not logical. You say foreign investment falls into developing countries. Our war is not predicated off of investment in developing countries. It's predicated off the IMF specifically subsidizing a green investment, which means even if you're winning this turn, it doesn't respond to the thesis of the argument that the IMF engages in bond markets that causes results in the green tech industry, which means this outweighs all of your arguments. But then on the econ debate, none of your arguments matter, and our study is more important. Prefer the murky evidence because we are actually specific in indicating that we control for selection by it. This is really important in the round. The reason why I brought it up in Grand Crossfire because the IMF only invests in the countries in which they've already are experiencing economic crises, which means that a recession is already happening in these countries. And because of that, when you control for these facts, the IMF programs decrease poverty 18% and result in long-term economic growth. They're going to make these arguments that the length of the IMF program is 5 years. That doesn't matter. If anything, if the IMF destroyed these countries' economy, they wouldn't come back to IMF for loans. It flows our way. Also, this isn't a study. Prefer our evidence because of methodology. When they try to go for this evidence that says it controls for non-random selection, that's not the same thing as selection bias. But then on turns on privatization. On water privatization, we're winning and extending the turn that water privatization caused a decrease in infant mortality 8%. You're going to go for this evidence in Ghana. Your evidence from Ghana is not terminalized. It says cost increase 95%. That's not a terminalized impact. Our impact says mortality decreases 8% because there's investment in renewable energy. And also on your civil war argument, you conceded internal link defense that civil wars has no resource extraction does not cause civil wars, and it also causes diversification because countries are able to use their revenue from developed countries in order to invest in other sectors of the economy, which is why Malaysia proves empirically. You've also read no counter evidence that Malaysia does not prove an example of how they were able to diversify their economy away from resources in the long run, which is why our evidence is better and also the climate change outweighs at a higher level.
This round is really simple. They've completely conceded what Roy extends in summary that the intent of the IMF is bad in the first place. IMF countries come back to the IMF every 5 years. All Conrad says in final focus as well, if this doesn't matter, they wouldn't come back. The IMF is literally their only option. There's no warrant for why they wouldn't come back if it leaves them in a worse off situation. Any risk of fixing the crisis they're in right now is obviously why they would go to the IMF, which means in either way, countries always come back. It's controlled by Western institutions through the veto power, completely conceded, which means in any case, Western institutions always want the resources that IMF, the countries that need IMF loans have, which means they always come back, puts them in a cycle of resource extraction. We agree that climate change comes first. That is completely fine. They have fully conceded so many links in. First is the idea that resource extraction controls the link into climate change because massive emissions are emitted in countries' resource extraction sectors. But second, on civil wars, there's obviously massive emissions emitted through the military industrial complex, which means either way, we still link into climate change. It's fine that it comes first on the impact level. Then they've conceded the IMF subsidizing a few million in green technology is far smaller than the size of a conceded 25% decrease in FDI because IMF programs are known to cause crises, which means they have on net less money for green technology, which is why they've conceded that emissions are only rising in the status quo in IMF countries. It empirically disproves all of their arguments. View this filter through you should evaluate the round through this filter. Obviously, if emissions are increasing, they are not doing something right. They've fully conceded all the impact defense as well. One, the IMF has no way to regulate anything because the US and China are the biggest emitters of countries. Either way, you reach their impact star of 150 million lives. There's no scalar impact rate, which means you literally can't vote on this argument. Even if you leave the climate change comes first, they have no link. And they've also fully conceded the idea that there's massive that renewables are bad because they cycle through every few years, which means there's a massive increase in e-waste, which also kills people. Okay, on our argument. about resource extraction. The only response to the Malaysia empiric: one, they've dropped it over 70 countries with IMF loans. With IMF loans, 88% got dramatically more dependent. Don't buy their empiric. But two, a recent IMF loan is desecrating all of Malaysia's progress, which means, and they've fully conceded Roy's front line on this, which means it's empirically not true. Extend the argument, it's pretty simple. IMF loans cause an increase in resource dependence because that's literally the only thing that these countries have left to invest in. And obviously, that it's emits more emissions, which links into all of their climate change scenarios, short-circuiting your case. That's how you're voting. All right, good round, y'all.
Good debate, you guys.